viewers and listeners joining us from different parts of the world. My name is David Anadiwanashechikwaza, and this is Africa in Perspective Conversations with David. My guest today is joining me from Harare, Zimbabwe. Her name is Anna Brazia, and she is a sustainable development consultant based in Zimbabwe. She is a prolific author and has written a number of books, including Climate Change in Zimbabwe, a guide for planners and decision makers. She has also written Harnessing Zimbabwe's Indigenous Knowledge for Climate Change Adaptation. She has also written several booklets promoting Zimbabwe's indigenous foods. She has a BSc Honors in Ecology and an MSc in Sustainable Development. She has lived and worked in Zimbabwe since independence. Anna's work focuses on the nexus between agriculture, nutrition, and environment. She supports NGOs, government, and other stakeholders through her projects that make food systems more diverse, nutrition sensitive, and climate resilient. She is team leader for communications team in the National Adaptation Plan Readiness Project under the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism, and hospitality industry. She's also part of a team contracted by FAO Zimbabwe to analyze Zimbabwe's food system and help identify ways to make it more sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers and listeners, the topic under discussion today is climate change policy and elections. Why climate change emergency should matter to the electorate and electoral candidates ahead of the 2023 elections. Before we begin our conversations today, as is our custom, ladies and gentlemen, let me give our guest an opportunity to give us her opening remarks. Anna, welcome to Africa in Perspective Conversations with David.
David, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoy our conversations. We've interacted quite a lot over email. I always like talking about climate change. Although it is quite a scary subject, and I hope I'm not going to depress anyone with this interview. But the important thing is that if your listeners do feel unhappy, that should motivate them into action, because it's up to all of us to fight against climate change, and what every individual does is crucial. So yeah, if anyone feels unhappy, turn it into action.
Lovely. Sustainable development goal number 13, climate action, climate emergency. Well, Anna, how's Harare, Zimbabwe today? How's everything? How's the weather?
The weather's beautiful, although it's a bit warm for winter. I know everyone's complaining about the cold, but I think you'll find that when you look at the average temperatures, we're experiencing a very mild winter so far. And although this is nice because it means we don't get too cold, it's a bit worrying because we need that cold in order to build up the rainfall patterns. So yeah, what happens in winter affects what happens in summer, and we need to watch the weather. Although Zimbabwe does have a naturally very variable climate, so we never know what to expect in Zimbabwe.
I guess so. Well, Anna, I have a couple of questions for you. And the first question that I have for you is probably due to underdevelopment. Studies reveal that climate change issues have over the years been of less importance to the electorate, subsequently to those they elect into office. Why do you reckon this has been and continues to be the case?
Well, David, it's not just a problem that affects Zimbabwe. I think all over the world, populations have worried more about economic growth and economic issues and social issues above environmental issues. And this is because people have become increasingly divorced from their environment as they've urbanized. In Zimbabwe, our economy is very dependent on the environment, ironically. But people are not so aware of this fact. And when it comes to day-to-day bread and butter issues, they're more concerned about jobs, they're more concerned about wages, they're more concerned about health, education. So of course, these things are important, but we really need to remember that all of these things depend on our environment. Zimbabwe's economy is heavily dependent on natural resources. We get most of our income in terms of GDP from agriculture, and from mining. And those are natural resources. And if we don't look after our environment, then these important sources of income will be degraded. At a community level, rural communities, the majority of Zimbabwe's population lives in rural areas, and their livelihoods and lives depend on natural resources. They need to get water from natural water sources. They can't rely on a municipality to give them water. They need firewood for fuel, and most of their food also comes from agricultural production. So if natural resources are ignored, we're not only threatening livelihoods, but we're also threatening lives. But this is something that people don't really see perhaps because of our education system. We're not really made aware of how important the environment is. People tend to think of it as being something to do with wildlife or something to do with forests. They don't realize that it's actually what human life depends on.
So I guess it also speaks about the issue of climate change literacy in many African countries, for example, in Zimbabwe. But I see there has been a bit of strides recently to try to address that issue, to try to make our education system more sensitive to the issue. You're talking about the issue of making our people know how important environmental issues are, how important climate change issues are. Well, nevertheless, I'll move on to the second question that I have for you. In light of scientific evidence as reviewed in reports from the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and other institutions concerned, do you think it's time both for the electorate and electoral candidates to treat climate change policy propositions as an important measuring stick in determining suitability for public office? If yes, why?
Absolutely. I mean, it was time 20 years ago. We've left it very late, not just in Zimbabwe, but globally. And it's, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, it's moved from a concern to a crisis situation now. When we look at the studies, not just done by the IPCC, but also done by our local scientists who have also done projections and scenarios for the future of Zimbabwe, it's really not looking good. Even if greenhouse gas emissions are completely stopped tomorrow, Zimbabwe is still going to be seriously affected by average temperature rises and by rainfall declines. So no matter what happens now, it's absolutely crucial that Zimbabweans begin developing ways to adapt to climate change. And that means at every level, at individual level, household level, community level, city level, and national level. So we need our policymakers to help us do this. We can't do it on our own. We need strong policies, and we need active, committed leaders who can guide us and give us the information that we need in order to tackle this life-threatening situation.
Lovely. Now, looking at Zimbabwe specifically, what recommendations would you give to the people of Zimbabwe who are registering and planning to vote? What place should they assign issues related to climate change, and why should they do so?
Well, firstly, they need to become informed. They need to find out what policies are in existence and what leaders are implementing in terms of those policies. We actually have pretty good policies in Zimbabwe. We have a national climate change policy, and we have a national climate change strategy, and they've both been well developed. The big million-dollar question is, are they being implemented? And this is what's crucial. We don't just want talk, we want action. So it's very, very important for people in any community, be it rural or urban, to look at what their leaders are doing, look at the condition of environmental resources. And let me just point out the connection between protection of environmental resources and climate change. So in order to adapt to rising temperatures and lower rainfall, we really need to protect our natural resources, such as our forests, our wetlands, our soil, and the water systems that we depend on, as I said earlier. So if we're not looking after those systems now, then when climate change does hit, it's going to hit really, really hard. And things like Tropical Cyclone Idai and the massive droughts that we've been experiencing will be nothing compared to what happens in the future. However, if we do look after our natural resources, if we protect the forests, if we make sure that water is conserved and used very wisely, if we look after the soil and enrich the soil, if we manage all of the natural resources that we depend on, then impacts will be less and we will be able to probably cope with some of the worst that climate change has to throw at us. But at the moment, this is not happening. At the moment, there is massive environmental degradation across Zimbabwe. And this can be blamed on individual actions because individuals are desperate to make an income. And as I said earlier, people depend on their natural resources for an income. So if someone is desperate for money and they see growing tobacco as the only way out, for example, then they are going to cut down the community forests in order to cure their tobacco. If someone is desperate for food, then they will over-harvest the wild fruits in the forest. And this, again, is going to impact on the whole community because it means that that communal resource is not available for everyone. In an urban area, if someone wants to start a small business and starts by polluting the stream or building on wetlands, that's going to impact all of the people around them. And when climate change hits, it's going to make everything much worse. So what's not happening at the moment is, although we have fairly good environmental protection policies, they're not being enforced. And people are looking at the short term because they're desperate. They're not looking at the long term. But my warning is that climate change is going to become a short-term issue. It already is really hitting people in rural areas. And soon people in cities and towns are also going to be really feeling the impacts. So we really can't afford to be short-sighted about this. And our leaders, we're depending on them. So the electorate must get informed. They must see what policies are being put forward, what portfolios the potential candidates have got in terms of environment, and really focus on those, because without those, we can't even talk about the economy. We can't even talk about health. None of those things matter unless the environment is being addressed.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. But there's an area that I think you can help us maybe shed more light on, and this is the area of the role of leadership. What role do you think leadership can play in terms of mobilizing communities, putting together communities, rallying them behind in order to address this issue of climate change, be it as it regards mitigation, be it as it regards adaptation?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point. I mean, we, as I said, we depend on our leaders. They have to lead us, and they can't lead until they themselves become informed. So it's absolutely critical, first of all, for leaders to get the information and to understand the issues around climate change. And it's difficult for leaders because it's a very complex subject. It's heavily scientific, it's very technical, it's full of jargon and long words, and you know, it is a multi-sectoral issue as well. It's something that will impact not only on temperatures and the economy, but it also impacts on people's health. It impacts on security. You know, once climate change really starts hitting, this could cause mass migrations of people escaping from drought or hazards such as the cyclone. It can cause conflicts. Already there are conflicts over water points in Zimbabwe. These could get a lot worse. People could start fighting over food. So security really is going to be something we need to worry about in the future. Our national borders could be threatened by migrants fleeing situations in their own countries. I mean, once the sea levels start rising in Mozambique, for example, what are people going to do? Where are they going to go? The most obvious place is to come to Zimbabwe because we don't have a coastline and things could be a lot better here than they are in Mozambique. Leaders really need to think about this and put themselves in the position of how Zimbabweans are going to be in the future. They need to get informed, and they need to start informing their communities. They need to get information out. They need to talk about these issues. They need to discuss these issues. Local government has a huge role to play as well. And the Civil Protection Department has tried to support local government by giving them information on how to set up disaster risk reduction plans in each community. But I'm not sure how many communities are actually putting this into place. A disaster can strike any community at any time. We just don't really know how to predict what's going to happen. It doesn't necessarily need to be a weather-related disaster. It could be crop failure due to pests, because crop pests are likely to become more frequent due to climate change. So the local leaders really need to mobilize communities. They need to put these plans in place. They need to particularly protect the vulnerable in the community. So they need to identify who are the vulnerable: women, children, people living with disabilities, the elderly. All of these people need to be taken into account in these plans. So if you are planning to vote for someone in your local constituency or nationally, you really need to find out what are they doing as individuals to be strong leaders, to put these plans into place, to discuss with their communities and their constituents these issues and what plans could be put into place for the future.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Very illuminating, and I think it's really helping us to understand the things that we must expect from our electoral candidates in terms of their manifestos when they are pitching what they are going to do, what they promise to do for their constituencies or for our nation. But whilst you are here, what work are you personally doing to assist Zimbabwe address climate change? And what impact is your work having towards the attainment of SDG 2030 and Agenda 2063?
Okay, so most of my work has been centered around working with development agencies. And I'm very interested in sustainable agriculture, because I think that one of the main threats to the environment in Zimbabwe is agriculture. Although we depend on agriculture, unfortunately, the way that it has been carried out in the past few decades is having a serious impact on the environment. So a lot of my work has been looking at how farmers can develop more sustainable approaches that produce nutritious food, but also protect the natural resources. And it's a tricky balance. Agriculture is related to food, as I've said, but it's also related to income. So we have to find a system of agriculture that gives families income, that gives families nutritious food, but also doesn't destroy the environment. And the systems that have been in place so far have not done that. Zimbabwe is really suffering from terrible soil degradation, from massive deforestation. And a lot of these agricultural systems come from developed countries. They were improperly promoted in Zimbabwe, such as ploughing. Ploughing, it was a terrible thing to promote it in Africa, because the soils here are very different from the soils in Europe. And ploughing actually causes massive soil degradation. There's been a lot of work done in conservation agriculture to try and stop people from ploughing and to try and get people to use alternatives. And they've been very successful. But a lot more needs to be done to protect and nurture the soil. The soil is a real foundation for life in Zimbabwe. A lot of my work has been very technical to do with agriculture. It's also been educating people on nutrition, and nutrition resilience is something that's very important with climate change in mind. If people are not healthy when climate change impacts because they haven't had a good diet, then they are going to become very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And this is something that can impact generation after generation. So good nutrition, good health is very, very important. Good agricultural practices are very important. And then a large part of the work that I've been doing in the last few years is really just informing people about climate change. People are amazingly uninformed. I don't want to say ignorant, because it's not their fault. The education system, as I said earlier, hasn't really covered it. And also because it's such a complicated issue, people tend to just zone out. When they see a headline about climate change in the media, they just flip to the soccer or some celebrity information. The last thing they want to look at is gloom and doom about climate change. So I've been trying to package climate change concepts in a way that's easy for people to understand and makes people really take notice of these issues. it's hard to do that without terrifying people, because if you terrify people, then they just won't listen either. So it's a tricky balance. I've done a lot of training of young people. I've done a lot of training of media to try and help them, because the media, we depend on the media to get the information to the masses. So yeah, I really enjoy the work. I'm going to continue to do the work. The book that you mentioned earlier, the Climate Change in Zimbabwe book, was specifically for policymakers. So I know policymakers don't have much time to read. The last thing they want to do is try and plow through one of the IPCC reports or something like that. So I tried to package the information to make it very specific and relevant to Zimbabwe, and make it readable for people from all different backgrounds in our policy field. I've also done simpler booklets for the general public, which have been translated into Shona and Ndebele, where we've also tried to use some infographics and cartoons and, you know, simple images to help people understand the concepts. And then last year, I did the Indigenous Knowledge Project, where we had barefoot researchers from all over Zimbabwe. When I say barefoot, I mean people who weren't trained researchers, but lived in communities. And due to COVID-19, we couldn't travel to the communities. So we depended on people in communities to collect information that could help us to adapt to climate change. Zimbabweans have the knowledge already, but that knowledge has been totally dismissed through colonialism and through our Western education system. And before we lose that knowledge, we need to gather it and find out what information can be used to help people adapt to climate change. So that's what last year was all about. And that was the book that you meant, the second book that you mentioned, which has also been translated into Shona and Ndebele. So that's what I do. I try to get information to as many people as possible in as many different ways as possible. And I'd like to thank you for helping me to do that by interviewing me today.
You are welcome. Actually, I'm more privileged to have you. I read your book, the first one that I mentioned, which is Climate Change in Zimbabwe, a guide for planners and decision makers. I should say that's a very good book. I found it to be very helpful. It really helped me with a lot of insight. And I think amongst many materials that you will find available, I think it's one of the leading materials that we actually have in the nation. And I would actually recommend all our viewers that are watching right now to look for that book and read it. It will help them appreciate climate change issues. And also, I think it will help them to also meaningfully engage when it comes to climate change issues. For example, this issue of voting when they vote, I believe it's a material that can also help them, illuminating them on this subject, so that when they are looking at, besides what you are saying right now, more to it, they'll be informed in terms of what they are looking for in an electoral candidate. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. But out of interest, do you feel that the Zimbabwean government has been and is doing enough? You have mentioned something that I think is very important, the issue of getting the information to everyone, especially in the layman's language. Do you think the government, in terms of, not only in terms of policy, because it appears like you're saying, in terms of policy, we have good policies. When you see them, when you read them, very good policies, very good write-ups. But in terms of implementation, do you feel that the government and other leaders, even at the local government level, are they doing enough to deliver the information in the layman's language?
Great. Yes, that's a good question, David. I think government could definitely be doing more. It's quite difficult when you're a technocrat, when you're a highly educated person, to really put yourself in the position of the average Zimbabwean, particularly people living in rural areas. And although Zimbabweans are generally highly educated, we have one of the most educated populations in Africa. That doesn't mean that it's easy for people to understand what climate change has in store for us. So I think it's about packaging information, which is hard for people with lots of degrees or people who are used to making political speeches. It's difficult for them to do. And I think it would really help if there were more professional media people assisting government and working in government. I think it would also be good if government tried to improve its links with the media. So if government actually kept regular contact with the media and regularly told the media what was being done to address climate change. Because I think there's a huge misconception in Zimbabwe that the government is doing nothing. And although I said the government could definitely be doing more, the government isn't doing nothing to address climate change. So if people go around thinking that nothing is being done, then they just lose all hope. And I think it would really inspire people and motivate people to know what is being done and to learn how they could actually build on that. I also think it's very important that Zimbabweans have become very dependent on the government and on NGOs to lead them and to live their lives for them. And they've lost their sort of individual motivation. When I was doing the Indigenous knowledge study, I learned about the systems that used to exist in Zimbabwe before colonialism and that have still persisted today in terms of how traditional leaders and communities worked together to protect their natural resources and to address issues that affected the community. And unfortunately, what's happened due to colonialism and policies subsequent to independence is that communities have kind of lost the power to manage and address their own issues, and they just kind of throw up their hands and wait for someone to come and help them. But I don't think that they need to do that. And the exciting thing is that because of the devolution process that is in the new constitution, it means that local authorities will be given more power. And now is the time to try and mesh those traditional systems of traditional leadership, traditional community gatherings and consultations with the local authority systems and the official formal government systems that exist to come up with very powerful groups who can work together to address these issues. We don't have to wait for government to do things. We don't have to wait for NGOs to do things. People can start doing things themselves. And I think this is really, really important. Zimbabweans must become empowered to start something tomorrow. So that is my challenge to all of your listeners, is if you are motivated by what you've heard today, go into your community and start forming groups, start talking to your leaders, be they the traditional leaders or be they the local authorities or others, church leaders, business leaders, get everyone involved and start discussing what you can do to prepare for this enormous challenge that is facing the whole of humanity, not just people in Zimbabwe.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anna, for that response. But I also think that in your response, you also imply that leadership also remains important, in as much as the people should take it upon themselves and desist from waiting for somebody else to come and help them implement solutions. Yes, leadership also remains important, because remember, everything rises and falls on leadership.
Absolutely. And if people feel passionate about it, then they should look to becoming councillors or MPs themselves. We need new leadership. We need young people to become leaders. So that's where it starts, is by feeling passionate about something and by seeing a way forward. So yeah, the next generation of leaders, I challenge you to put climate change as #1 on your policy agenda.
Lovely. Well, before I let you go, I'm going to have to give you an opportunity to submit your closing remarks. You might as well mention anything else you feel we might have left out, which is relevant to this topic or this discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. I think I'd like to once again thank you for inviting me to talk about this issue. It's a difficult issue, but I think it's something that I really believe needs to be talked about more, and not just talked about, but put into action. So as I said right at the start, don't feel depressed, don't feel despondent, but feel empowered by this discussion. If anyone wants to get hold of the books that we've talked about, I'm trying to make them available on the Zimbabwe Climate Action Facebook page. I've put the Indigenous Knowledge one up, and I'll try and put the Policymakers one up as well. They're also available in other places online. So they were published by Konrad Adenauer Foundation. If you go to that website, you can download them. And if you really feel you want a hard copy, you can also contact the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Harare, and you can get hard copies of all the books free of charge. They're not, you don't have to pay for them, but feel free to be informed. You can also contact me through the Facebook page, Zimbabwe Climate Action Facebook page. And yeah, let's fight this fight together.
Well, thank you so much for coming to the show, Anna Brazia. Looking forward to have you again in the future. But for now, goodbye. Thank you so much, our viewers and listeners, for joining us. Do not forget to follow us on all our social media platforms. And do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Till we meet again, it is bye-bye for now. God bless you.